Hi everybody, this is Agnes from Sediment, and today we are going to taste wines that may have been forgotten in the cellar a little too long. Usually I say that as a good thing. You can forget a wine in your cellar and rediscover it years later, and time will not have harmed it. In fact, it might have even benefited the wine. But sometimes forgetting a wine in the cellar means it has spent its best years locked away in a cool, dark, usually quite damp place, and its chance to bring joy to people's faces and minds has passed. This video was inspired by two things. First, I recently interviewed an amazing wine educator and master of wine, Christopher Burr, who has had a long and fascinating career in wine. Amongst his many roles and responsibilities throughout his life, he was head of wine sales at Christie's auction house and has evaluated many cellars. Over the lovely day we spent together, he talked about how often cellars are opened and sold after the owner's death by their children and grandchildren. And one thing struck me deeply. He said that you could really see how people had been saving certain bottles for a special occasion. Isn't that really sad in a way? We live our lives constantly postponing joyful moments, only in the end never to experience them at all. The other reason I decided to film this video is that the company I work for recently acquired a beautiful cellar from a restaurant that was closing. In their wine selection, you could really see the sommelier's passion for wine, and they were most definitely walking roads less traveled, discovering grape varieties and regions beyond the usual expectations. Of course, this was a commercial cellar, not built for one's personal enjoyment, and the decision of which wine to open for a special occasion may not have been entirely in one person's hands. However, I did find some wines there that, in my opinion, would have been best to be opened years or even decades earlier. And some wines were no longer reasonable to charge money for. But they sure as hell would have looked good on the list. So, out of curiosity, I decided to buy some bottles. Of course, they do not exactly represent the idea of a bottle for a special occasion, but they most certainly do represent bottles forgotten in the cellar. But who am I to judge? Maybe they are still full of life and energy. So shall we taste? All right, with few work-related injuries later, I will explain about this thing in a minute. We can start our wine tasting. So the first wine is going to be slightly controversial. So this is 2012 Monte Grande Soave. In my opinion, Soave is actually a wine that we can age, especially if it is coming from a prominent producer like Pra. And this is only 13 years old. So in my mind, this Pra Soave 2012 Monte Grande would be the wine that shows the freshest, the most liveliest character. Of course, it is also the youngest wine of all these four wines that I have. But I think that if we are comparing this specific label with all the other wines, we kind of, in our minds, expect it to be the least age-worthy. So let's try it. Oh, and one more thing, nowadays this bottle of wine will be under the screw cap. They have experimented with natural corks and with screw caps, and they have realized that wine stays fresher for much longer periods under the screw cap. So of course, we are currently tasting wine under the natural cork, so let's see. In all honesty, it does not show color of a 13-year-old or 14-year-old wine. It is quite youthful color-wise. We do see some of that slightly deeper straw color, but it is still very vibrant, it is still very bright. And I did sneak peek the nose, and it is honeyed and beautiful and fresh and really, stone fruit driven. Apricots, peaches, yellow plums, but those spiced apricots and plums, that spiced apricot jam with some thyme and rosemary in it. Let's taste the wine. Chardonnay, come to the front. You have a serious competitor here in this glass. Soave can age. good Soave can age despite the fact that you have learned in the books and you've read in, newspapers and on media that Soave is the simple, early drinking, fruit-driven white wine. No, this wine is 14 years old. It shows an amazing depth of flavors, an amazing freshness. And with this wine, seriously, we have been incredibly lucky because I have opened it exactly at its peak. I would say that this is its peak. Some smoky, toasty, sweet elements are also coming out. That lovely, complete mouthfeel of those ripe yellow plums and ripe spiced peaches and apricots with elevated juicy acidity without overpowering anything, just being this perfect, body, perfect itself, perfect embodiment of Soave. This wine is around 80% Garganega, and Garganega can produce quite high yields, and sometimes it can therefore become quite watery. So what this producer does, they air dry a little bit the grapes, so the concentration is also here, and it is incredibly long. So with wine number 1, Soave Monte Grande, 2012, we have been incredibly lucky. This one has survived its time in the cellar. Let's move to the oldest bottle today of our selection, which is 1977. And it is Fattoria Selvapiana. And this was the wine that caught me in trouble when I was opening it, because you see that the bottle, the top of the bottle is quite mature. And I have opened this bottle already, so you cannot see it right now. But the reason why I chose it was because it had really high houillage, meaning that the wine's shoulder level is incredibly low. And that means that we have more air in the bottle, and wine most likely is maturing at a higher rate. It is 77 vintage, which is a really good vintage in Italy. And when you will read about it, Fattoria Selvapiana, Chianti Rufina will often come out as one of the top bottlings. So it is only natural that we have this legendary label in the wine list of, beautiful restaurant. However, I think that with that level of houillage and at that age, this wine might not have lived through, but let's taste it and see how it has survived. So first of all, the interesting thing is that it is incredibly brown, of course, color-wise, but it is not dull. The color is not dull, it is still vibrant. There is some clearness to it. Usually when I see wines with that really cloudy, milky character, I assume right away that they would be much further in their development. But, color, there is no red in it. It is completely brown. On the nose, I don't think it is complete goner. It does have some of the toastiness. It somehow reminds you a little bit of how Madeira smells, of those dried and candied red oranges, really dried strawberries and raspberries and ripe red cherries as well. But you have that chocolatey, that caramel, that salted caramel-like element as well. And at some point, I felt this really traditional Latvian dish, dessert, which is dark bread soup. And it is basically, that dark bread soup with all kinds of dried berries mixed. It is like a dessert. It's a very unique one. And you really feel that. Usually that bread soup is also served with like whipped cream, and I feel that element of whipped cream here as well. Interestingly, this wine is only 12% alcohol. Let's taste it. Well, on the palate, this wine is also still live and still here and still quite present. I was really expecting it to be way past its life because, 1977, despite it being an amazing vintage and despite it coming from a top producer, it did have that really low fill neck. So I thought there's no way this wine could have survived that time in the cellar, and there's no way it is decent to take money for this bottle of wine. But it is mainly acidity that we feel, and slightly chalky tannin texture. But that acidity is not completely austere and not completely, raw. You do have some of that fruit element hanging a little bit there. And I think it is overall a really nice experience for those who want to explore older bottles and understand how wine can develop. However, for me, it would not be more than that, more than an experience. All right, let's move to the wine number 3, which is Barolo 1997. 1996 was the most iconic and legendary vintage, and that vintage would for sure have stayed in the cellar. No questions asked. That would be beautiful. 1997 was a bit trickier. It had that early appeal. So I would expect that maybe this wine has developed a bit faster than maybe other vintages of Barolo could. And I specifically wanted to choose this wine as well, because even though it is not that old, it is 9-ish years old. And we do think of Barolo as being one of that iconic, epic wine from Italy, but it has not always been the case, and there are still many professionals who will argue that, especially from the 80s and 90s, Barolos can sometimes have too much of VA, that volatile acidity that will overpower and overtake the fruit. And maybe only nowadays, with modern times, we have developed that idea of really beautiful, age-worthy, Barolo, because it has what it takes. It has high acidity, it has tannin, it has the texture and fruit concentration and alcohol. All of those elements contribute to how long you can age wine. So let's taste this wine. All right, here it has similar color, brownish, a bit lighter because, Nebbiolo as a grape variety does not develop deeply colored wines, but we don't have the same brightness. It is not as dull sometimes as other wines of, older age could be. There is still some, brightness to it, but it's definitely not as clear. Okay, you know me, I love Nebbiolo, I love my Barolo wines. This specific wine, in my personal taste, has lost all of its fruit, and there is a bit of that VA that overpowers it. In this specific case, it really smells of that nail polish removal. It has that paint thinner element in it. Yeah, and it really, it is not as dull. That's true color-wise, but it has that cloudy texture, that slightly milky element to it. It is true that while you have the wine in your mouth, it might not seem as gone as it actually is, because that acidity adds a little bit of freshness to the wine and lifts it up. But once you spit it out, there's nothing really left. There's no mid-ground, no mid-palate here. We have that really drying tannin texture that is dominating the palate, and that really elevated acidity that is also dominating the palate. And in wine number 2, the Chianti Rufina, we had that, slightly dryish fruit character hanging on to the acidity. Here it is only the textural elements that wine has, and unfortunately all the fruit has evaporated already. I think that this wine, unfortunately, is past its prime. So let's move to the wine number 4, which I think will be the most interesting of them all, and that is Ernst Triebaumer. It is Blaufränkisch, Kabinett, 1983 vintage. So nowadays, we would see Kabinett only or mostly on white wines. And historically, I would see sometimes these predicats used for red wines as well. This is interesting, and I wonder what that means, but basically Kabinett and all the other predicats like Spätlese and Auslese, they identify how late the grapes were harvested, or rather at what sugar level were the grapes harvested. So here we could expect that maybe it was a bit later than usually. However, alcohol level, we don't have here. That's interesting. Anyway, this is Rust, a smallest city of Austria, where I have spent many weeks studying wine in the Wine Academy of Rust. And it's really interesting for me to taste this wine because I know Triebaumer's wines quite well. He is really well known for their red wines, specifically Blaufränkisch, and the labels are quite different right now. But yeah, let's taste the wine right away. Did I say it's 1983? Unfortunately, I do think that this wine is slightly corked, and I can show you the cork itself. It is really small, and nowadays it would be quite unacceptable to bottle a wine made for longer cellaring under such a small, tiny little cork. I was happy actually to manage to pull it out because I broke almost my finger trying to get cork out of this bottle. But this one, it's tiny, and naturally, once it is so small, it cannot fulfill its function as well as maybe, longer, higher quality cork could have. But that, I think, is the story of those times. You could not necessarily get always, the best cork, the higher quality corks as well. And we were not as educated about the cork taint, and where it is coming from and the quality of corks and how that does influence the wine. Yeah, but it's definitely corked. And if I can feel the cork, the TCA here, it is quite corked. I am not that sensitive towards cork TCA anymore after the COVID. Let me just taste it. I don't want to, but let me just try. You kind of feel for a second there those really beautiful fruit flavors, but then the TCA comes and just wipes it all away. And that is a pity because I think we could have something really interesting and great, something to talk about here. And I would have loved you to see how Blaufränkisch, as a grape variety, can really shine and maybe even outshine all of these other wines. In a way, yes, you kind of have small glimpse of, that beautiful, ripe, but quite crunchy fruit characters of, wild raspberries, blackberries, and cherries. But they just open the door and the light shines through and then they shut it. This is how the TCA works, unfortunately. So here you go. This was quite interesting. As I was expecting, Soave did the best work. Soave did the heavy lifting with all these wines. And if I would have to choose which wine to come back to, which wine I would have another sip, it is definitely this beautiful Monte Grande 2012 Soave by Graziano Pra. I do think that rest of the wines offer great experience. They do not offer amazing enjoyment or wines that you would love to, sit by the table and just meditate with. It's just, okay, this is what it tastes like at that age, and that's it. So of course we can pay for that experience, but if you are going to the restaurant, I think we are mostly expecting to have nice food, to have nice drinks at our table. But maybe I'm wrong. You, please let me know in the comment section below. Would you be excited to see these wines on the restaurant wine lists? Would you be excited to order them and pay for them an extra buck? And please let me know if you also are sometimes guilty for storing wines for a special occasion. Thank you very much for watching and make sure to watch this video next.